It goes without saying that critics and fans alike were disappointed by Game of Thrones' 8th and final season. Throughout Season 5 up until Season 8, viewership gradually divided due to several factors, including deviation from and omission of source material from George R.R. Martin's book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, particularly during Seasons 5 and 6. And once the show surpassed the books during Seasons 6 and 7, fans noticed a precedence being put on battle sequences and ending storylines, rushing to destinations instead of enjoying the journey, like in the first 4 seasons. In turn, this introduced uneven pacing, formally complex characters becoming one-dimensional or outright contradictions of their old selves, plus other contrivances to the plot that have been pointed out in numerous videos critical of the show's conclusion, which ironically have become the cathartic outlet for many upset viewers. While the show had been divided since 2015, it wasn't until Season 8 when even those who had defended the show through Season 7 began to side with the critics. Up until this point, Game of Thrones had been praised for its rich history, detailed politics that expanded the conflicts beyond just battle sequences, and introduced betrayal as a major risk. There were allegories that audiences associated with the real world, such as the Others being a metaphor for global warming, or as John Hodgman writes in the foreword of the 20-year anniversary illustrated edition of the first novel, there are many in this book who want to make Westeros great again, one way or another. Some we like, others we hate. The show was also praised for its development of numerous complex characters, any of whom, even the most important, could die at any moment. Even though many bad things happened to several of the characters we love, Martin's books were never about who dies next. They were about being mortal, human, imperfect, and these characters, their actions drove the story through unpredictable yet satisfying and believable adventures. A Song of Ice and Fire is a fantasy series of character-driven stories, as opposed to plot-driven stories. Game of Thrones also starts off this way, but once the show became praised for adapting these excellent qualities, it was reported that showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, commonly referred to as D&D, apparently became big-headed over this acclaim. One can make the case that this is hearsay, but there are hints of D&D using Martin's creative decisions to demonstrate their courageousness of killing off some of these characters. For example, Benioff compares Eddard Stark's death to that of killing off Tony Soprano.
You might do a terrible thing to a side character, you might murder off a minor character, but you're not going to kill Tony Soprano.
But the reality is, even though Ned gets the most point-of-view chapters in Book 1 of A Song of Ice and Fire, and Sean Bean gets top billing and most screen time in Season 1, this story is driven by an ensemble of characters. So, comparing Ned to Tony, who is inarguably the main character of The Sopranos, is very misguided. Fast forward a couple of seasons to Season 3's penultimate episode, The Reigns of Castamere, which was highly praised for its dramatic and heartbreaking finale, now known as The Red Wedding, which portrays the deaths of Catelyn Stark, her eldest son Robb, and his direwolf Greywind, massacred by the Freys because Robb backed out of a marriage pact with one of Walder Frey's daughters, in favor of Talisa, who is also present and slaughtered at the Red Wedding while pregnant with Robb's child. Many Song of Ice and Fire fans were eager to see the reaction of friends and family who watched Game of Thrones, but hadn't read the books. Book readers knew what was coming, and the show's adaptation helped them vicariously relive that same shock when they had originally gotten 2/3 of the way through Book 3, A Storm of Swords. But even though The Red Wedding was shocking in the books, the show's portrayal became a pop culture phenomenon and brought Game of Thrones to new heights. And while the show maintained its quality for an entire season afterwards, with Season 4 wrapping up the final third of A Storm of Swords, The Red Wedding ended up being the peak of the show, as subsequent characters' deaths never reached the same notoriety despite the showrunners' efforts to replicate that reaction. It wasn't just that the show had more viewers than the book had readers that led the show's portrayal of the Red Wedding to enter the mainstream, it was also the fact that Talisa isn't a character in the books, and Robb's bride, Jeyne Westerling, isn't even present at the Red Wedding. Talisa being present and pregnant added to the shock of this massacre. Lastly, the tragedy of the book's version of the Red Wedding has been arguably downplayed by the presence of Lady Stoneheart, a reanimated Catelyn Stark who leads the Brotherhood Without Banners after Beric Dondarrion sacrifices himself to bring Catelyn back from the dead with the Kiss of Life. While Lady Stoneheart isn't introduced until the epilogue of Book 3 and makes a brief appearance in Book 4 and is only mentioned in Book 5, the most recent book as of this video's making, her presence is lingering throughout A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. Not to mention, Martin has stated she's going to be important in Book 6, the forthcoming Winds of Winter. Alex Graves, one of the directors on Game of Thrones, mentioned that the writers just simply weren't convinced going through the trouble of bringing Michelle Farley back as Lady Stoneheart would be worth the trouble unless they knew for sure Lady Stoneheart would play a significant role in the plot, as opposed to being just a cameo. A more cynical fan can interpret this as the showrunners didn't want to run the risk of undoing any praise they received from the tragedy of the Red Wedding because Lady Stoneheart's presence lessens that blow, as Catelyn is technically still part of the story. It was after the Purple Wedding that Martin inexplicably breaks ties with the show. There have been explanations for this, as well as many rumors, including not just creative differences with D&D, but also how the showrunners began to treat him. YouTuber Midnight's Edge actually does a great expose on this, in which his sources tell him that D&D began to get big-headed about Game of Thrones' success, crediting themselves for the praise as opposed to Martin's source material that they adapted. And the showrunners began to get impatient with Martin's slow writing process and demanded results, or else they'd just write the story themselves. Regardless of how you feel about these accusations, it's still a fascinating video that Midnight's Edge created, so I'll put a link in the description below. It was around this time, Season 4, that the show started to prioritize killing off characters. Even from the beginning of the series, no character was technically safe, but it was during Season 4's penultimate episode, Watchers on the Wall, that D&D began attempts to replicate the shock of Ned's execution, the Red and Purple weddings, and the results of the trial by combat between the Mountain and the Viper, all of which were adapted wonderfully and have a purpose in the overall plot. In Watchers on the Wall, our storytellers reveal their outright simplistic bloodlust behind some of their creative decisions and deviations from the source material. In this episode, we see two deaths, albeit minor characters, Pip and Gren, who are still alive in the books.
While neither of the characters die in the books, it felt like we had to have some casualties amongst the people that we really care about here.
David Benioff and Dan Weiss, who are the showrunners, they're killing characters who are still alive in the books. So as bloody as I am, David and Dan are always turning things up to 11.
While this episode and the remainder of Season 4 are lauded by fans and critics alike, this creative decision was a turning point. The show needed to be about who dies next. It was around this time that another show, which also started off very strong, was beginning to decline into a mindless slaughterhouse. The mid-season finale of The Walking Dead's 4th season featured villain the Governor illogically choosing to kill Herschel instead of Michonne, the latter of which the Governor had an actual grudge against. Michonne had killed the Governor's zombie daughter, and it drove him over the edge. Not to mention, he's using Michonne's own weapon, a katana, to select who he's going to slaughter. In-universe, it makes absolutely no sense for the Governor to choose Herschel over Michonne. This was the boiling point for many viewers who had invested in a show whose last season and a half had been playing the Guess Who Dies Next game with its audience, and it was more about the element of surprise rather than what made sense. Around this same time, Game of Thrones was going down that exact same path. And since then, characters' deaths have become underwhelming and senseless. While many viewers were quick to notice this, Game of Thrones had many other appealing qualities that prevented its audience from jumping ship. One of the things that kept viewers invested was redemption. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when film producers were allowing directors more creative freedom than ever before, there was a rise in the anti-hero, such as the man with no name from the Dollars trilogy, Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, or Tony Montana in the 1983 Scarface remake. Scarface being a remake of a 1932 film is essential to the point because back in 1932, the studio required Tony to be portrayed as a villain, and he had to die without dignity. But fast forward 51 years, and the villain is now charming, screaming countless memorable lines, and going out in a blaze of glory. Granted, the concept of an anti-hero stretches back to Thersites from Greek mythology. Our fascination with villains being the main character of our story, however, would become particularly normal with transgressive literature that became mainstream in the 1990s, such as Patrick Bateman in American Psycho or Tyler Durden in Fight Club. While these characters are fascinating, humorous, interesting, and maybe even charismatic, we're intrigued for voyeuristic reasons. We want to experience a life we'd never want, but are curious about. George R.R. Martin uses characters with these similar qualities, but he finds a way to make them sympathetic through deep-rooted trauma, careful and complex in-universe history, and the concept of different points of view. It's easy to root for underdogs like Tyrion Lannister, Jon Snow, or Bran Stark, but it's something else to sympathize with an incestuous turncoat who attempts to push a child to his death for finding out his deep, dark secret, or a hateful man so consumed by self-pity that he's willing to kill the innocent just because he's ordered to do so. Or someone with such a pathetic desire for acceptance that he'll sack a castle that's treated him better than his own family. Or someone so certain of their faith that they'll burn people alive, including a child, because they're convinced it's what their god wants. This is such a captivating element of the story because Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire trusted its audiences enough to not only pay attention and invest in the long term of this story and these characters instead of getting quick payoffs, but it also relied on the viewer's willingness to be open to different perspectives and even forgiveness. From the get-go, it's pretty easy to spot where the rage comes from in both Sandor Clegane and Theon Greyjoy. We're introduced to the Hound at his lowest point by the end of the second episode, when he kills Mycah under Joffrey's orders. But there's a subtle light of hope in doing good when he saves Loras Tyrell during the Hand's tournament. Even though the Hound may have intervened as a way to stick up to his brother Gregor, it triggered a sense of hope. From there, he had a slow but steady incline in decency, showing tough love for Sansa Stark, even saving her from rape. And when the Hound decided he had finally had enough and left King's Landing, he became a mentor and companion to Sansa's sister, Arya. Theon's redemption is triggered more out of sympathy than any sort of selflessness, but once he's on the redemption arc, he does plenty of selfless acts. Throughout Season 1, we see him as one of the Starks, yet not a Stark. His closeness to Robb, and having grown up in Winterfell for the dual purpose of being a ward and a prisoner to Ned Stark, confuses Theon as to whom he should feel angry towards: his father Balon Greyjoy, his captor/mentor Ned, all Greyjoys, all Starks, and in turn, this understandably complicates where his loyalties are. In Season 2 and Book 2, A Clash of Kings, Theon is entrusted by Robb to recruit the Iron Islands to become allies. However, when Theon returns to the Iron Islands for the first time since being held captive at Winterfell, Balon reveals he plans to attack the North while it's poorly defended, which is an opportunity for Theon to prove himself as a true Ironborn. Having never felt like a Stark or a Greyjoy, and desperately seeking purpose, Theon reluctantly agrees to fulfill his father's wishes and betray the Starks. This results in Theon committing heinous acts, although not done without hesitation or guilt. While the book and show diverge on how Theon got into the hands of Ramsay Bolton, this is ultimately when we begin to sympathize with him. To actually witness Theon repaying for his sins through long, drawn-out torture, coming from someone who is no better than him, forces the reader and viewer to sympathize with Theon out of mercy and pity. Before we continue to the second half of this video, please make sure to like, subscribe, share, ring the bell, become a patron at my Patreon, and visit my website, www.cwschultz.com, where you can get to know a little more about me, my 4 published novels, all available at Amazon.com, my award-nominated film Watch, excerpts from my upcoming 5th book, Whispering of the Autumn Leaves, and links to my short stories, such as Rooster, which was featured on the NPR-recognized podcast 7 Minute Stories. It's not until season 3 when redemption has a more significant impact to the overall story. Jaime confesses to Brienne of Tarth that his reason for killing the Mad King was much deeper. In betraying his honor, he saved the lives of countless innocent people. Not only does this make us reflect that perhaps Ned's idea of honor was much more simplistic, introducing a whole new perspective of events, but it also forces us to be put in Jaime's shoes when he pushes Bran out of the window. He was trying to kill one person, yes, a child, in an attempt to save Cersei, himself, and their 3 children, all of whom Robert Baratheon might have easily ordered executed. Like the Hound rescuing Sansa from rape, Jaime saves Brienne under similar circumstances. However, it comes at a price for Jaime, his sword hand. To Jaime, he didn't just sacrifice his hand, he gave up his purpose. This actually changes him as a person. On the show, we get a somewhat rushed redemption arc out of Melisandre. We don't see her at her lowest until the penultimate episode of season 5, when she burns Shireen Baratheon alive. Similar to Jaime's motive for breaking his oath and killing the Mad King, Melisandre has the mindset that this one death could save the lives of many more. Hopefully this internal conflict will be explored more in the books, as Martin has introduced Melisandre as a point of view character in the 5th book, A Dance with Dragons. Unfortunately, on the show, there's not really a whole lot examined after Melisandre resurrects Jon 3 episodes after killing Shireen. If the books maintain its consistent pacing and give us more point of view chapters for Melisandre, she has a potential redemption arc that could be just as compelling as Jaime, the Hound, or Theon. There is fault, however, with how the show ended these 4 stories, and we conclude by merging Part 1's positive reception of killing off major characters and Part 2's redemption arc summary into the final part of this video. Prior to the release of Season 8, shadowandmovies.com wrote a very interesting piece about redemption arcs, which follows 3 steps: the mistake, the punishment, the redemption. In particular, this article excellently summarizes Theon's redemption journey, who just so happens is the first of these 4 characters to die, followed by Melisandre in the same episode, The Long Night. Critics and viewers alike took issue with the handling of the White Walker mythology, illogical military tactics, lack of catharsis, plot armor, and the use of dark production lighting. However, one thing many of these same critics seem to praise about this episode is how Theon's conclusion was handled. The problem with this ending is that Theon's death actually amounted to nothing. Why would Bran, who's the all-knowing, all-powerful three-eyed raven, allow such a major sacrifice for a minor inconvenience to the Night King? Was Theon's purpose to bring pain and suffering to others so that he could go through it just as much, all for the purpose of stalling the Night King? Just as unfortunate, there's not much to talk about with Melisandre's ending. Say what you will about a lot of characters' deaths in Season 8, but nobody went out with more of a whimper than Melisandre. As someone who follows the Lord of Light, you'd think she'd go out in a blaze of glory. Instead, she went out with less dignity than a candle on a toddler's birthday cake. The last 2, the Hound and Jaime, died in possibly the most loathed episode of the entire series. No, not Beyond the Wall. The Bells. There are controversial ways to end a show. There are fitting ways to end a show. There are bland ways to end a show. And finally, there is apparently a way to end a show in such a baffling fashion that the long list of characters' deaths within this one episode isn't even the thing most discussed about it. Let's put it another way. If, in 2014, back during the season 4 days, someone were to tell you that there would be an episode in which the Hound, the Mountain, Jaime, and Cersei all die, you'd probably think, whoa, that's a bigger massacre of main characters than the Red Wedding. These characters' deaths are going to be the talk of the town for years to come. In reality, the creative decisions, which were likely the end result of rushing things and an attempt to subvert every possible expectation, resulted in the final 2 episodes of the series being so bizarre that a slaughter of several major characters isn't even the topic of discussion. You have Dany and Drogon mindlessly zigzagging to the Red Keep, taking every possible detour. Then there's Grey Worm, who somehow knew his queen would betray everything she stood for and immediately followed suit. You have Jon distracted by some Northmen who wants to get in one last rape before being burnt alive. Then there's Arya aimlessly running through the bleeding streets of King's Landing, showing off her plot armor. And finally you have Davos and Tyrion, neither of whom have any reason to be present, just standing by, watching. Amidst all of this distraction, two characters who had been the representation of betterment and forgiveness met a very meaningless and forgettable end. Both of them die alongside their siblings, each sibling having embodied these characters' downfall and weaknesses. The Mountain was the cause of the Hound's scars, and thus was the cause of him starting off our story as a very hateful man, doing things he would later regret and struggle to forgive himself for. Jaime's love for Cersei is the cause of his faults, willing to sink to any level to protect her. However, when he's away from her, he's actually his best self. Cersei is Jaime's addiction. With a few more episodes, Jaime's ending might have worked. Him dying with Cersei in his arms is a good old-fashioned Shakespearean tragedy that's in line with some of the things that have been foreshadowed.
How do you want to go?
I'm sick of the woman I got.
And in terms of redemption, it shows that people can relapse. It may not have been the ending many of us hoped for Jaime, but had it not been rushed and the logistics of how he ended up back in King's Landing been more carefully thought through, this relapse, if D&D felt the need to go that route, could have had so much more meaning. While A Clockwork Orange, for example, isn't necessarily a redemption, it follows Alex, who commits a series of crimes that he takes joy in, which ultimately leads to his downfall of getting caught. His punishment comes not only with incarceration, but also the Ludovico treatment, which doesn't only make him nauseous when he witnesses or experiences violence, but anytime he associates something with the Ludovico treatment, including Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The cruelty is that he wants to vomit every time he experiences something that used to give him pleasure: music, sex, and a little bit of the old ultra-violence. This ultimately makes him defenseless when he's released back into a society that's unforgiving towards him. As a result of Alex's unexpected helplessness, the Ludovico treatment is forced to stop. The effects of it wear off of Alex, and he relapses into his old dangerous self. Within the context of the story, it's meaningful, memorable, and ultimately the perfect ending. So if Jaime's ending was going to go the relapse route, A Clockwork Orange is proof that this creative decision can work, when done correctly and with proper pacing. The Hound's death comes as a result of a meme. Why the Hound feels the need to return to King's Landing to kill his brother makes no sense when he should know that's technically not even his brother. It was an excuse to realize Clegane Bowl, which started as a joke among fans, and when it's actually brought to life, both of these characters are invincible until the plot says they have to symbolically plummet into fire. Almost nothing about the 8th season, particularly the final 2 episodes, sat well with fans. But opinion aside, what does the ending of these 4 characters say about redemption? Did these characters change their evil ways, if you want to make the argument they were evil in the first place, just to die? If that's the case, what's the point of redemption? Is it saying there is no hope for someone like Jaime, Theon, the Hound, or Melisandre? While Martin has yet to complete his vision of these characters, it'll be interesting to see if all 4 meet their demise in the books like they did on the show. But it does not seem in line with the idea that Martin has for forgiveness. It is somewhat simplistic, even immature, to end all 4 of these stories with death. It dodges the more difficult questions. Theon's case in particular, in which in prior seasons had raised the question whether living with himself is actually his punishment and death would be a gift.
If you're so broken that there's no coming back, take a knife and cut your wrists. End it.
Instead, Bran basically gave Theon permission to die. He allowed Theon to walk into certain death, an assisted suicide. It was easy. It was simple. As simple as cancel culture. When someone has said or done something wrong, the only solution is to say you're sorry, have your reputation tainted forever, and then go away and never come back. It was almost like D&D were trying to appease to this type of simple-mindedness, rather than rewarding the longtime fans who actually paid attention and were invested in the more complicated issues that garnered the books and show so much interest in the first place. The questions being raised weren't easy, so why are the answers so simple? You did something wrong, you can't take it back, now die. If you think otherwise, if you think throughout all the growing these characters did, not one of them earned an ending other than death. If you think only bad people do bad things, or you think a bad person can't grow into a good person, then let's end with something George R.R. Martin himself said. One of the things I wanted to explore with Jaime, and with so many of the characters, is the whole issue of redemption. When can we be redeemed? Is redemption even possible? When do we forgive people? Our society is full of people who have fallen in one way or another. How many good acts make up for a bad act? I don't know the answer, but these are questions worth thinking about. I want there to be a possibility of redemption for us because we all do terrible things. We should be able to be forgiven. Because if there is no possibility of redemption, what's the answer then?